Hey folks, welcome back to the DarkHorse Podcast, our 16th live stream, the Q&A section where we will answer as many of your super chat questions as we can get to. So,
we had a glitch in the downloading of the questions this time. And so during the break, Zach and I were working furiously to collect them, but it is possible that we missed some and we never get to all of them. But we tried to get all of the ones above a certain dollar level. Apologies if we missed it. If you would email the DarkHorse moderator, which I think is at darkhorse.moderator@gmail.com.
I'm not going to pretend that I know.
Yes. With your question, if at the end of this we didn't get to it, we will prioritize. If it was above a certain level, we'll prioritize it for next time.
Yes, and from the perspective of preventing this collapse on future live streams, please, when you upload questions, make sure the filaments in the wire have been tightly twisted together and don't let the pressure get above 30 psi. Thank you.
That's a very good PSA.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Cliff High with a large donation.
Thank you, Cliff.
Says, consider personal consciousness. Where in the body do you understand it to be bound? Where do you feel it to be bound? And where do you think it to be bound? I know, but want your thoughts. Are these informed by psychedelic experience? Do you know the biological mechanism of the binding?
Well, I thought I understood the question until the last question in the sequence.
The question with regard to the biological mechanism of the binding.
Of the binding. The binding seems like something very precise, and it could refer to the binding of the neurotransmitter mimic in a psychedelic entheogen. But I don't know if that's what it's getting at. I would say...
Well, I think the question is informed by psychedelic experience. That's one thing I think is true.
You think it's immediately informed by psychedelic experience?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
This seems quite clear-headed, I think, although I'm not sure. I think there's a premise here that we might disagree with if I could quite understand what the premise is, but I'm not sure I know what it is.
Yeah. I suspect that much to the annoyance of all sorts of people, that consciousness, individual consciousness, is a feature of the mind being what the brain does, and therefore where in the brain. Does that mean that there's nothing to thinking about it in any other way? Probably not, but yeah, from the perspective of what kinds of damage you might get that would interfere with your consciousness, I suspect it is localized in that way.
And, I would say localized, and with ever less strength potentially, the less dense you are with regard to nerves. So, the CNS, the central nervous system, which includes not just the brain, but the spinal cord, might be the core area. And there are things that the motor neurons and sensory neurons may be doing, and the interneurons that could be transmitting aspects of consciousness that we don't understand.
I'm not going to ask you how dense you think I am with neurons or anything else, but I will say for Cliff and anybody else who's interested in our thinking on consciousness, what we have argued is that individual consciousness is a secondary adaptation that follows from the consciousness that exists between individuals. And the consciousness that exists between individuals is not localized in the same way in the mind. That's where the model would take place. But the fact that it is an emergent property between two people means that it is in effect not localized in the same sense. So I don't know if that answers your question, Cliff, but I hope it sheds some light.
All right. Next question. Do you think that truth scales? If so, might the prince with what's written as Maslow's hierarchy, I think he's referring to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, distinguishing noble and common needs or people, be a good barometer for one to govern oneself? And might Peterson's 12 rules be a rubric for a government to follow in governing a population? Nate, who also donated a fair bit, has packed a lot into this question. Let me just say it again so that it's, I think there's three questions. There's a question and two possible answers here. Do you think truth scales? If we think the answer is yes, Nate posits that perhaps The Prince, which is Machiavelli's famous book, in which the noble versus the common descriptor that Machiavelli uses might be mapped onto Maslow's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, be a good barometer for self-governance? And might Peterson's 12 rules be a good model for government governance? That's how I understand the question, but there's a lot more to be unpacked there.
Some truths scale, at least to some extent. Do any truths scale infinitely? Hard to say. I'm concerned about anything like trying to take something like the Prince, and yes, it might be better if your Machiavellian tendencies unfolded internal to you as an individual. It's probably a closer approximation of something decent. But the problem is you might well end up deferring to some entirely somatic view of life where you effectively took that as a license for hedonism, which I don't think is a very good use of a life. So no, I wouldn't advocate it as a principle. Maybe the harm you do is to yourself rather than to others, so it's not so onerous. But anyway, I'm not sure about it, and it doesn't strike me that Peterson's 12 rules are scaled properly for the governance of populations. I don't think that's their intent.
I think quite precisely. I mean, I've read the book and I found it quite excellent. But it is specifically about how individuals should act. I feel like it is far better in that first position of a good barometer for how to govern oneself, or at least how to start governing oneself before you figure out how you may be different from your neighbors. But that it doesn't seem really to be a rubric for a population level analysis. And I think you would agree with that, although I'd be curious to have that conversation.
Yeah, I suspect it.
And then with regard to the first part of the question, which you already addressed, do you think truth scales? I would say maybe that patterns and ideas may scale. So, selection, for instance, natural selection exists at all of these different levels and across domains, even in non-biological domains. And so that is a kind of scaling, whereas, it depends on what kind of truth we're talking about. And that sounds like a wishy-washy trying to get out of the question, but some truths will scale, maybe never infinitely, but some truths are completely hyper local to the space and time in which they exist.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've done a good job of nailing the most likely candidate, which would be that the things that accumulate in the universe will be patterns that come into existence frequently, that are similar to each other when they do, so they're recognized as a category, that are durable upon arrival, and that capture limited substances or other properties of the universe such that they effectively outcompete other things that might contain them. So that's the underlying substrata on which Darwinism floats, and it applies to all sorts of things that have nothing to do with biology. And so if we just apply it to patterns, yes, that's the most likely thing to apply at every scale in the universe. But then again, what do? It tops out at the universe, I think. Or maybe not.
Right. All right. Next question from Raphael. With gatekeeping in academia and the crisis happening together, and the current pandemic crisis, presumably, how do graduate students live and participate? What to do if advisors are gatekeepers? Advice if you can't find positions because of gatekeepers in theoretical parts of science and math? Oh, man. This is a good and clearly heartfelt and difficult question.
I think the best we can do is probably, we feel for you, and it's a really terrible situation, but the way limited resources are allocated in science puts people in charge, many of whom are not worthy of that kind of responsibility. And we've seen it up close, and many people who might steer us in a much better direction if they were liberated to do so are constrained by the fact that they are effectively forced to fall on their swords if they go in a direction that does not please the hierarchy above them. So this is a puzzle that needs solving, and there's nothing riding on it but the game.
Yeah, very much so. I guess, we can talk about this a little bit more. This doesn't get so much to how you find positions after you've gotten a degree. How do you find positions in academia after you've gotten a degree, which is its own set of problems. But when you're actually in graduate school, and if you have an ability to choose between advisors and see that some seem to be more of the gatekeeping type and some less, you can imagine that it's actually, it would make a lot of sense from a self-interest position to be a gatekeeper as an academic. And in fact, whole departments tend to be of the sort of gatekeeping mindset or not. And even in those departments that allow graduate students more freedom to choose their own questions, as opposed to slot into a space in a lab and ask a question that's handed to you, even in those departments that tend towards the more freedom for graduate students to ask the questions and, sink or swim, which is certainly the way that Michigan's biology department was when we were there. Even there, you'll find some of the would-be advisors, some of the faculty being more gatekeeping. And so really finding a place where, choosing an advisor who has students who are asking all range of questions, who engages in conversation in which disagreement happens, and in which the entire lab is not dependent on one or two or a longitudinal string of large grants, which are basically, you're going to get a reversion to the mean. You're going to get more and more orthodoxy if you're reliant on the big money coming in from the government grants that require the same kinds of results as have always been coming in. So, find someone who is doing more eclectic, heterodox research, but of course, those people themselves are becoming harder and harder to find. We both, all three of the advisors whom we had, who you mentioned in the last hour, Bob Trivers, Dick Alexander, and Arnold Kluge, were all of those things. They were heterodox and encouraging. They wouldn't. None of them ever would have wanted students to simply slot into their own research. They would have found that absurd and anathema. And yet, it is the common thing for graduate advisors, especially at least in many aspects of STEM. I know less about the other parts of the academy.
Yeah, one thing you could do is you could consider cryogenics. You could have yourself frozen and then see if it's any better in 100 years.
Are you drinking alcohol?
No, I'm not. I'm not drinking anything.
You can't tell. You picked a nice glass.
That question brought out the darkness in my mood. Is what happened.
Next question: could very different or mildly different bat coronavirus variants evolve in different bat species? For instance, rhinolophids versus pteropodids, who live in the same ecosystem or cave.
Of course, the very fact that you asked the question means you must understand the basis on which it would happen. There's always a question about what the gap between species means about the likelihood of it finding its way across. But
so
sure.
rhinolophids versus pteropodids is a pretty big gap. It's kind of as big a gap as you get within bats.
So this is I believe the expected distance between these two has shrunk on the basis that rhinolophids have been moved towards pteropodids.
Yeah. Actually, not as far as it would seem.
Not as far as it would seem, given that rhinolophids are what we call microbats and pteropodids are megabats.
But there's that new framing, the Yingto versus Yangda I don't remember what the prefixes are they've used, but they've got the rhinolophids and the pteropodids, which are the big fruit bats, in the same group now.
Yes.
Those people who do bat phylogenetics.
The bat gatekeepers.
The bat phylogenetic gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Is there an evolutionary reason why women have the ability to achieve multiple orgasms? Thank you. I like the thank you after that. I don't know how to go after this one.
Sure, of course there is.
But then what?
Well,
there is.
Let's
because
put it this
exists
way.
And it's complex and it's iterated and there's variation in how much people experience it.
So this is not my first time to the rodeo, I must tell you. Do you remember when we were teaching together some years ago and a very nice, intelligent young woman in our class asked me to explain female orgasm and the evolution of lady bits during a lecture? So I learned in that incident.
Is that the phrase she used?
Yeah,
evolution of lady bits.
That was the phrase, and it was very important that I not become embarrassed at that moment, which I didn't.
I'm not sure I do remember this.
So there is one thing that must govern your actions should you ever be asked a question like this. Should you be male, or I guess a gay female,
which I'm not,
which is that the answer you deliver must leave people with the impression, they don't have to understand your answer, but they must be left with the impression that you are something of an expert about female orgasm. That is what they should walk away with the question from. So to that end, let me just say that...
I'm glad I'm letting you answer this one.
Yeah, me too. This is going all right. Yeah. So female orgasm is not obvious, which is why people ask about it. The fact is females, by the nature of being the limiting sex, have a very easy time coming by gametes if that's what they need. And so why have this powerful reward system accompany various sexual acts? And the answer, I am almost certain, has to do with the nature of human pair bonding and the fact that the male orgasm has been borrowed by selection, appended to females slightly differently, but appended to females to facilitate a kind of sexual bonding that results in an increase in fitness. So, in other words, females being rewarded by sex in this very direct and powerful way, behave in a fashion that is more likely to result in successful reproduction, that is to say, offspring that go on themselves to reproduce. And my argument would be that that is basically to induce females to engage in behavior that is rewarding to males such that they stick around at some level.
I agree with all that, but I don't think it addresses the question.
It didn't have to. It just had to leave the impression that I knew a lot about it.
Okay, you did start there.
Yeah.
But I think as much as that was actually a great answer to the question of, is female orgasm adaptive?
Yeah.
Right. But this question is specifically about multiple orgasms, which is the part of the question where I'm like, I don't know actually what to say here. Yes, adaptive, but why? And I don't have anything in particular on that.
For one thing, this is an incentive to females, but it is also an incentive to males. In other words, to the extent that, male orgasm and female orgasm are very different in the sense that male orgasm rather famously changes one's frame of mind almost instantaneously. Mm-hmm. The fact that it doesn't do that for women, and I'm not saying it doesn't do it at all, but the fact that there could potentially be other orgasms down the line, keeps male attention focused. And again, the point is going to be the bond is actually vital to the fitness of both parties, and therefore each one is structured to deliver the other what is needed in order to keep them engaged.
Okay, that's good. It keeps the male focused. 20, 40 years ago, that would have been described simply as mate guarding, but it does the same trick. It effectively keeps you close potentially, and ready to go forward to potentially even non-sexual behavior, but it can go sexual again.
Yeah. And for those of you interested in this style of question, I would just simply point out there are a whole set of features of human sex and sexuality that are utterly unique, and some of them that are mostly unique: having sex when not fertile, female orgasm, concealment of ovulation, persistence of female breasts enlarged when not feeding offspring. All of these things are part of a very sexually unique species, and the puzzle pieces don't fit together in a way that it's completely obvious why we're built this way, but it is a set of questions that is well worth spending some time thinking about. And don't treat sex trivially. All right. Dad,
I'll come
out.
back to that. Mandated lockdowns curtail our liberties and destroy wealth and livelihood on a grand scale. Advocates for lockdown bear the burden of proof to show that a larger catastrophe is likely. Has that burden been met? Well, there's an assumption in the question that advocates for lockdown bear the burden of proof. And it's this, I think, would benefit from us being able to have a back and forth with the person who asked that question. I can't even see the name of that person right now because of the thing that happened between the two live streams. What a larger catastrophe being likely, what would be the burden? How would you know likely? Where would you set the bar for likelihood?
Or larger.
Or larger, given that lockdown, if it's successful, will reveal not as large a catastrophe as anyone was predicting. How do you measure success? All of these are real concerns. And I think the big place here that I, at least, and I think you, Bret, would probably at least begin disagreeing with the questioner, is that advocates bear the burden of proof to show Well, actually, I'm not sure that's the issue. It's,
There's some tools you need to unpack this. There's the question of ex ante versus ex post. In other words, you have to figure out what we would expect going forward, where we don't know what happened, versus what will have happened after we've been through it. So here we are choosing one of two paths, and they will have different outcomes. So there's an expectation of what the path will bring, and then there's the reality of what it does bring. And those two things, the ex post is not so interesting because we're making the decisions ex ante. There's a question about precaution. So obviously there are costs both ways, and obviously we don't end driving just because it would save lives. We decide that a certain number of lives we're willing to lose in order to retain driving. So by analogy, certainly there's a certain number of lives that we would be willing to lose not to have to go on lockdown, but presumably that number is something we can discuss, and that the tens of thousands of deaths that we look like that we appear to be staring at, and there is substantial data now about what results from the relaxation of lockdowns, what has resulted in places where the lockdowns have not occurred or have been less stringent. So we do have a lot of information, and the information that I have seen so far does suggest that there are many lives being saved by this policy. And the other thing, and I don't think anybody's really getting this part, we don't yet know what's going to happen down the road. We are limiting the number of individuals in which this virus gets to evolutionarily experiment. We may be saving ourselves an indefinitely large amount down the road by paying the cost up front of lockdown. Now, I can't say for sure that that's happening, but it does need to be in the conversation about whether or not to do this. Can we slow this thing down by giving it less territory in which to experiment long enough that we can get ahead of it? What happens if this thing is recurrent and comes back to people who've been sick again and again over their lives? If you knew that to be the case, you would understand that it was much more important that we prevent people from getting sick, because it's not like most of these people get sick and they get better. They get sick and then maybe they get sick again and they keep spreading it. Now, I'm not saying that that's happening. I think it's probably not happening, but until we know for sure that it's not happening, it justifies extra caution. And I think a lot of these things that we're looking at are the same structure, where the unknowns are still substantial. And at the moment, we have this thing somewhat limited. We could have done a lot better if we've gotten on it earlier and had been more stringent. We could have potentially stamped it out in a matter of weeks if we had gone at it aggressively and rapidly, and instead it took us long enough that it escaped the possibility. So those are the things we're playing with. And I think when you hear from those of us who think that stringent measures are necessary, these are some of the parameters we're talking about.
That's great. What are your leading hypotheses on the mechanism of consciousness? That is the hard problem of consciousness. Please discuss your theory with Sam and Annika Harris. And is consciousness binary, on or off, or is it made of parts or layers? I'm serious. But he's included an emoji.
Oh, God. That's confusing.
Yeah.
Take it?
Well, I mean, I think we can direct people to what we've written that's not published yet, but also the talk that we gave at Princeton a couple weeks ago now, that's available online at the James Madison Program site, and so that will get at the second third of the question, which is conscious binary or is it made of parts and layers? And I suspect, although I don't know if we've exactly talked about this, that there is that I anyway imagine that there is a sort of a moment of illuminating, right? But then beyond that, it very much scales with the complexity of the brain and the social system and the developmental history and the length of childhood and the number of generations living together and all of this, so that it's not binary in that you have it or you don't. Except, yes, probably most organisms don't at all, but then the degree to which you can be conscious is largely explanatory in terms of whether or not you end up being able to, for instance, have conversations like this. And then the mechanism is a different one, and maybe we already sort of covered it with the first question.
Yeah, I'd say we are not believers that there is a hard problem. The hard problem is taken to have two parts. One is what's it for? The other is how does it work? What's it for seems more tractable, and our answer involves consciousness being a necessary layer constructed in the mind in order to understand what another mind is saying, thinking, feeling, etc. And so there's an emergent consciousness between two individuals that is necessary for them to plug their minds into each other in order to parallel process a problem, which results in higher quality answers than the two minds working separately would be able to accomplish. How does it work? Obviously, that's a technically tougher issue, but is it so tough that it's not going to yield to techniques that study neurological phenomena? I don't see the slightest bit of evidence for that. It's a phenomenon of the brain, and it's a marvelous one. Is it, it's not going to be a threshold, right? We can define a threshold and we can say, is this animal across it or not? But the fact is, even in your own consciousness, you can feel that there are things of which you are highly conscious, things of which you are not conscious at all, and things that hover somewhere in between, and that you can push that boundary around at will by concentrating on things or ignoring them or whatever you do. So there's no reason to expect that that's not an analog for the way this is distributed in nature.
But you would argue, would you not, that there are certainly organisms that have no consciousness?
Oh, yeah.
So that does suggest a threshold of sorts, but not one beyond which it's really interesting to talk about. Do you have it? Do you not? Like, there's some level of consciousness, and it's highly variable within space and time, both at the micro and macro level.
I mean, it sort of seems to me like, vascularization or something. Mm-hmm. Yep, there are going to be some entities without any, and then there's going to be every gradation up to the maximum amount, and that maximum amount is probably not a theoretical maximum, it's just what we happen to have the maximum of. And so my guess is consciousness is like that, and a spruce tree isn't going to have any, and mm-hmm. A spider probably doesn't have any, and probably an octopus doesn't have any, smart as it is. A cat has a bit, a dog has a lot, and people have the kind of consciousness you get when it comes packaged with linguistic capacity, which is, leaps and bounds beyond anything else. Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, questions from Echo. The Rationality Rules video that you referenced, Bret, said that homeopathy is literally false, metaphorically true. It sounds conclusion-driven. Can you give your take on homeopathy, and how can its mechanism be compared to vaccines? And Echo packs a lot into her questions.
Wait a second. I am not sure that I interpreted the video to say the same thing. Was homeopathy not described as placebo-like in that video? And in that video, he did a very...
I don't think
you haven't seen the video.
Yeah.
So he unpacked metaphorical truth, and he goes through the Peterson-Harris debates, and, I was very pleased that he said I had come closest to rescuing the baby from the bathwater with metaphorical truth. Anyway, his point was, and actually I was thinking about doing a response, his point was, Bret seems to speak very carefully about behaving as if something is true rather than believing that it is true, because he claims I am avoiding the trap that would be set for me with placebos. Now, placebos are a topic that is absolutely deserving of an exploration. It's not what you think it is. But nonetheless, I liked his conjecture. I wasn't 100% sure that I was consciously avoiding the trap of placebos, but I am aware that phrasing this carefully does avoid a whole spectrum of bad fates. And so anyway, to make a long story short, I am curious whether I have misunderstood what he said about homeopathy or you did. I will have to go back and look. But he's right. My rubric for presenting metaphorical truth does negate the question of the importance of placebos, because it's a question of behavior, not belief, the way I have phrased it.
Mm-hmm. Good. Behavior, not belief. And then the end of that first question from Echo is, how can the mechanism of homeopathy be compared to vaccines? And I would say at a first pass, there doesn't appear to be a mechanism of homeopathy. It is entirely belief. And to whatever degree that belief can change outcomes in some sectors, it therefore has the possibility of sometimes having an effect. But vaccines are actual biological agents that are being used to get your immune system to respond on your behalf, and homeopathy is doing nothing of the sort.
Yeah. The vaccines take fragments of something or inactivated viruses, and they inject them into your system where your system recognizes them as hostile, and it learns to fight them in their enfeebled or non-viable form. Then it's better prepared when you are challenged with an actual pathogen.
Rather like the dead viruses that are being shed by the people who were infected on the Theodore Roosevelt, right?
Yep.
Sorry, go on.
No, that's it.
Good. Okay. Second question from Echo. Second questions. You say that values are discovered. If we agree to kill bedbugs because of traumatic insemination, I'm not sure that's the phrase intended here, but
no, it is.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay. If we agree to kill bedbugs because of traumatic insemination, we agree humans hold better values. Say bedbugs don't feel pain. Is pain a prerequisite for bonding and consciousness?
Okay, Echo. Some humans have better values than bedbugs. All right.
You sure you're not drinking?
I have not had.
You didn't even invite me.
It's water.
I know.
Really. I know. Yeah. So I want to understand this question. First of all, I think there's a conflation of things, several things. Values are values discovered. I certainly don't think I've ever said that. We've talked about the need to navigate to superior locations, superior being defined by an agreement on the values that we are trying to reach.
What would be the alternative? Discovered versus created?
Well,
like
those
that they were always there and they're being discovered as opposed to created by humans.
I think this is an is-ought issue. I think there are those, for example, Sam Harris, who I think sets a high bar in general. People who believe you can derive the ought from the is are loons. Obviously, Sam isn't. I don't think he's right, as I've told him. But nonetheless, you could deduce values if they were properly connected to is. My point would be, why bother? If you take people, reasonable people, and you query them about their values, what you will find, and I've done this experiment many times, is that in general, most people, at least in the West, share a large number of values. What they don't share is the ordering of them, that is to say their priority relative to each other, or their assessment of where we are as a society with respect to realizing those values. We differ over that. But in general, what we all want is pretty similar. And so anyway, you don't have to derive this from an is. It probably isn't possible to derive it from an is, and I'm just not sure there's any value in it. So the question then is, we should kill bedbugs because they infest your house and your bed and they cause a terrible rash. That's good enough reason for me, not because their values are bad. In fact, I can pretty much guarantee you they don't have values. They're little robots that are programmed to do their bedbug thing.
As with so many of Echo's questions, we could unpack it. I think the question itself is so fractal. It has many, many layers.
Yeah.
But maybe we will move on in order to get through a few more of these questions.
So the last thing Echo says is bedbugs don't feel pain. Is pain a prerequisite to bonding and consciousness? I don't know if it's a prerequisite to consciousness. But I would say...
But it always does predate it in evolutions of consciousness that we see on this planet.
Yeah. On the other hand, the things that you have listed that contribute to the likelihood of the evolution of consciousness are all things that would require pain to keep you out of damaging trouble.
Which would suggest, therefore, that pain is a prerequisite for consciousness.
I wouldn't call it a prerequisite. I would say it always precedes it, in the same way. Yeah. So, you have to be born to feel pain, I guess, but prerequisite's kind of it's not a logical prerequisite as far as I know.
Yeah.
But I would say there is an argument to be made that pain or some analog of it is a prerequisite to meaning. I wouldn't be surprised if that was a fair claim. So anyway, don't know if that's what you're after. But
that's good. I like that. Thanks for the podcast. This is a two-part question here. I'm going to read both of them. Thanks for the podcast. You've both earned my trust. Great. Thank you. Can you more thoroughly address the Reddit article by virologist James Doerr, PhD, which argues for the non-lab emergence theory of the virus? Doerr resorts to ad hominem attacks, appeals to authority, and strawman arguments, but he also makes scientific arguments that my music degree has not trained me to evaluate. I believe this is the long one that we got asked about last time, and that you then, what you said about it last time, and I haven't looked at it, was it's super long. It appears to engage a lot of the arguments, and that leads you to suggest that maybe it's doing something right. But when you picked a piece out of it somewhat haphazardly, you found that he wasn't making good sense. So you've now spent just a little bit more time with it.
I spent significantly more time with it. And what's
perhaps.
more, I've handed it off to some folks who know more about it than I do. And I must say, it doesn't get better. It gets worse. Now, that said, I'm having trouble remembering the name of the author. I think this is the right paper, but if we are discussing some different paper, then all bets are off. But if it's the one we were asked about last time.
Well, the question, and again, I'm sorry, I don't know your name at the moment because of how we're looking at these. Can you more thoroughly address the Reddit article?
So this is the article that last time I said was an error because it claimed that the SARS-CoV-2 would show hallmarks of genetic engineering if it had been altered, and does not show them. And it's wrong on both counts because it wouldn't necessarily show them. People have, Ralph Barrick, for example, has demonstrated an ability to do seamless editing. And the other thing is this virus does show some evidence, but this is actually a good, maybe this is what you're looking for. To say that this virus shows some evidence of genetic manipulation is not to say that the evidence is conclusive. It is to say some evidence. So I think we've been tripping over this, those of us who've been discussing this in public, which is to say, people say there's no evidence of, and that's just not true. There's lots of evidence, and the evidence doesn't all point in the same direction. So we have to be very careful, and we should frankly be generous with each other, because we all have an interest in figuring out where this thing came from. We do, whether you realize it or not. We just simply do. So anyway, I think that paper's full of flaws, and I believe soon we will explore them more deeply. Maybe not with respect to that paper itself, but the general arguments it's marshaling.
Next question. Dumb necessary plumber here. Is it possible for mosquitoes to be a vector for COVID? I want to start by addressing the setup for this question. Dumb necessary plumber. I assume that dumb is included here because much of the white-collar world imagines that those who do real work that has manifestations in the physical world aren't as bright as those who sit behind desks and work in cubicles and such. And this is, of course, a position that we have argued against stringently forever. Not merely because so many of our most brilliant students themselves came from the trades, often, and not merely because we both do physical work ourselves and have learned sometimes the hard way how difficult much of it is and how valuable it is, and how doing work that has a manifestation in the physical world means it's not gameable, and therefore you actually know at the end of it whether or not you've done something right or wrong, whereas so much of the work that's passing for intellectual work, or at least white-collar work now, has no such outcome, and so you just can't tell, and so those people are more likely to potentially fool themselves more and more and more. You can't do that if you're a plumber. So let me just start by addressing the idea of a dumb plumber. I don't think it's possible, really. Is it possible for mosquitoes to be a vector for COVID? No. I think we have seen it transmitting in so many places where there are not mosquitoes at the time of year where it's transmitting. It's transmitting almost entirely indoors, where mostly people don't have mosquitoes. And vectored diseases just have very different hallmarks to them, and I can't say what they all are, but I would say I would put a lot of money on this isn't a vectored disease.
Well, we have to do a little interpretation of what the question is. Is it currently vectored by mosquito in any meaningful degree? I think we know it is not.
Okay.
I can obviously construct a reducto ad absurdum where you've coughed on a mosquito and somebody inhales it, and, so that's conceivable. Is it conceivable that it could evolve to be transmitted by
people biking together?
Totally. But could it evolve to be vectored by a mosquito? Here's what I would want to know. The first, if I became obsessed with this question, the first thing I would want to do is figure out whether any coronavirus is being vectored this way. And I don't know. There's certainly, so yellow fever is an RNA virus vectored by mosquitoes. So RNA virus, yes, but yellow fever isn't a coronavirus. Right. So I would love to know, are there any known coronaviruses vectored by mosquito? If the answer is no, then the answer to your question is probably not. If the answer is yes, then the answer to your question is could be. Let's not give them the opportunity to evolve that trick.
Yeah, let's not. Please, here's a request for us to look at something that we haven't seen yet, but I'll just read it. Please look at Potholer 54T's fantastic analysis of SARS-CoV-2 sources with the YouTube link. His points about evolved versus chimeric origin are particularly relevant.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the danger model, or DANGER, I don't know which it is, in immunology, which says right there that I at least don't know it. NIH has a great videocast series by Polly Matzinger, which may or may not be related to this. You know that name?
I believe I saw some very good stuff. I couldn't swear that was the name, but I think so. The DANGER model. So here's the problem: is I took immunobiology at the University of Pennsylvania back in 1991.
87?
80. Right.
Yeah.
80.
Or I don't know, you were a freshman or sophomore, so 88 or 89.
It's a great course.
Yeah.
Did I learn this model? Did the model exist yet? And have I forgotten that that's the name of it? I don't know.
We at least don't know it by that name.
Yep. If it's new, then probably we don't know it. If it's old, then probably I knew it, but I've forgotten that's the name.
Yeah.
Sorry.
What time are we at, Zach?
42.
42. Okay.
That's probably about the right time to switch to the second.
We got two more questions, and then I'll switch. We got a few more, but let's just do the next two here. Have you read any of the work done by David Deutsch and his take on Popperian epistemology? Regardless, do you think Popper had it right? Knowledge through conjecture and criticism, not empiricism. So that's an interesting characterization of Popper. That's not how I would have characterized it. I think I know what is being alluded to here, but it's not the part of Popper that we were focused on through Kluge and such and epistemology when we were in graduate school.
Yeah.
And I certainly never heard in the long discussions that we had about Popper and falsification and such a desire to throw out empiricism. But I don't know. Can you go farther with this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Popper had it at least partly right. Falsification is clearly a huge step in the right direction. I would doubt he had it completely right, and he certainly didn't all along. One of the most important things, and the reason that he was sort of contentious in our grad school environment, was that he had initially been kind of an anti-adaptationist, and he came around later in life. So that's to his credit that he saw the power of this style of thinking. Anyway, so I would say, loosely speaking, I feel Popperian. I'm sure I don't subscribe to all of it. I also feel Darwinian, and I don't subscribe to every detail. But anyway, yeah, did he have it right? He advanced the ball substantially.
Yeah. And with regard to David Deutsch and his take, I have read some of Deutsch's work, but I don't remember his take on Popper particularly. I don't know if you do.
Me either. At the moment, I'm a little leery based on his multi-world stuff. But
Deutsch's.
Yeah. So anyway, not much to say, unfortunately.
Yeah. The last two questions I wanted to read here are both ones I'm not sure that we can do particularly well on. Have you any thoughts on Terra, preta, the black earth of the Amazon? Thanks as always. I don't know what that is, and I don't know if it's possible that the spelling is throwing me, and I don't know. I will look it up.
I have
do you know
some
what it
thoughts.
Is?
Yeah.
What is it?
it is a kind of self-renewing, artificially enriched soil. So it's part of a Amazonian agricultural tradition that goes back a couple thousand years. Anyway, here's what we've learned.
Done by agriculturalists in the Amazon long before there were any people but the original Beringians in the New World.
Yep.
Who are doing this sort of with bioactive techniques, like.
Well, so it's reminiscent of what the Maya were doing, in the sense that the Maya had very sophisticated soil chemistry at the empirical level. What they understood about what they were doing and why it worked, we have no idea.
Sure.
But
in both cases, both the Amazonians and the Maya less so, but we're working with very poor tropical soils, as tropical soils tend to be, except in volcanic zones.
Yep.
So they needed to enrich their soil if they were going to be agriculturalists.
The Maya, in many cases, were working with alluvial soils, which are better than average, but we're still talking about a tropical alluvial soil, and the Amazonians were obviously working in an environment in which there's a lot of nutrient, but it's not in the soil. It's not very deep at all. So anyway, these soils were enriched in a way that, as my understanding, which is very superficial, is that they are sort of self-renewing and that they're still sort of functionally findable.
Still now.
Yeah. So anyway, amazing, right? It's fantastic. If the story is anything like we think it is, it's a case of human beings having made a discovery of some form that allowed them to alter the capacity of the Amazon to deliver crops, and that in effect what they've done is something, where we would have trouble reproducing the level of success on that soil. Yes, we could drench it in some kind of externally derived fertilizer, but a self-renewing soil would be, beyond us, what we could do. And yet people who didn't have sophisticated laboratories or a periodic table or anything were able to deduce how to get there. And this is the nature of human beings. It's the flip-flop between culture and consciousness, and this is the kind of thing it produces.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Zach, you want to show us questions from the next live stream? Okay, we are giving our wonderful 16-year-old son 1 second.
Has he been upgraded to wonderful?
He has, yeah.
Excellent.
I made that decision without asking you.
You didn't have to ask, you knew.
Yeah.
This window right here.
Okay. Heather, what is the biggest challenge you witness Bret face or overcome? Bret, what is the biggest challenge you witness Heather face or overcome? Man, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Do we want to try to answer that now, or do we want to save it for having with the promise that we will try to address it, but save it for?
I'm cool either way.
Okay. Well, I guess. So the thing about us looking at this screen is that we're seeing us like 10 seconds ago. That's super weird.
I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's fine. I think the trade-off having to do with your unique brilliance makes it difficult for you to meet some of the expectations of a modern society. And
go on.
I know that to be true, as do you.
Yep.
And it is not for lack of self-awareness on your part. Certainly when we first met, when we were in high school, you weren't aware. But watching your self-awareness of your own difficulties meeting expectations that need to be met, that are not simply onerous or stupid, rise with a rise also in your ability to overcome that, but it's not commitment with, like, the rise in your ability to overcome it hasn't gone as fast as your rise in self-awareness. So in some ways you're ever more frustrated with yourself, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Is that right?
Yeah, and it sucks. I know what I should be doing. I just can't make myself do it.
Yeah.
All right. So, I'm going to swap the answer I was going to deliver for a better one. I think.
Okay.
More insightful
Will
one.
you share with me the other one later off air?
Sure. Nothing that would surprise you. But the thing about Heather is that she was tremendously introverted. And she still has these instincts, but she has discovered over time that the value that she can deliver in the world, that her ability to generate things that she holds in high enough esteem to be worth her time, has required her to find skills to function as an extrovert, even though it is not in her nature at all. And in particular, when you first started teaching, I think you were just mortified by standing in front of the class.
I hated it.
Yeah, you really did.
Yeah.
And so I watched in a very short number of years. It wasn't like this was the way things were at the end of your teaching at Evergreen. This was the way things were all along, you having learned this trick as a teaching assistant in graduate school. But you managed to induce a kind of desire to impress you and get your approval in students that most people, if they had that kind of influence over people, would abuse it or they wouldn't take it seriously. But you used it so carefully and so honorably in order to get students to perform at a level that most of them did not know that they could perform, that it was astonishing. Because, first of all, people were very frequently, your students were very frequently intimidated by you. And so they would talk to me about this. For some reason, they were less intimidated by me. And they would talk to me. It's absolutely true. They would talk to me about, their concerns. And if somebody did something great and your feedback was, of course, always extensive, and you would deliver this piece of feedback to them, and they would be just so overjoyed to have discovered something that was of enough value to catch your attention and all of this. So anyway, my point is, you mastered something that was outside of what even felt comfortable for you at first. And, I think you still have this tension within you, but the way you overcame your own shyness in order to be able to slam dunk the role of professor and be the professor everybody needs, and most people who see it know enough to want that, right? That was stunning. And I have to tell you, among the things that makes me absolutely the most livid about what happened in Evergreen was that they dared to do this to you after you had risen to the top of this this role where students adored you, and they were so right to do it because what you were doing was so good for them, and that these people treated that with such disrespect was just despicable, absolutely despicable.
That's an amazing answer. Thank you.
It's all true. And you know what? There's not a student that was in your class who wouldn't back me up.
Thank you. How about this for the next unknown virus? Offer $100,000 to people to get infected and live on site if the infection clears. Sample size 1,000. In 2 weeks, we would have an estimate of the death rate.
I love ideas like this. I don't think we need it, and I don't really want us to engage in this kind of thing because we don't need it. But I think we need to start thinking like this.
But it would give us more than just a death rate, right? It would give us other clues to how it progressed in people who didn't die and how people recovered and such. But it would mostly give us a death rate at a particular moment in time. And as we've talked about, as you specifically talked about in the last live stream, and as we've been talking about for many of them, the fact is that one of the big reasons this is so hard to pin down is that it is rapidly evolving. And so that would give us a snapshot of its early evolution, especially if it's an emerging virus that hasn't known humans before now. That first moment that it's in humans is not necessarily going to look like the moment 3 months later or 6 months later or a year later.
Yeah. So in principle, something like this, I prefer, in the case of infectious disease, that we find good natural experiments so that we don't end up confronting the ethical dilemma of effectively paying people to suffer harm on our behalf and things like that, which, the people sign up for clinical trials and stuff. So it's not like that's unheard of. But anyway, there's a slippery slope here, and I would like not to step so far onto it that we end up, a crumpled heap at the bottom.
Yeah. I have followed you since Evergreen debacle. Thank you. What do you do when you are weary? Well, a number of things. Yesterday, I had a particularly agonizing and horrifying day trying to learn new tax software and get our various threads, financial threads, into a single coherent mass, and it was not successful. And I mean, I was literally in tears at times, which doesn't happen very often.
There's a point in the middle of the day where you were flirting with the concept of anarchy. I saw it.
Yeah, that's rarer than tears for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And at some point, I don't know, 6:30, you came into where I was working, papers and computer all around me, and just, my head in my hand. I'm like, oh my God. And you said, we're going outside. And it was a gross day here. It was cool. And I mean, for May, it was dark and gray and a little windy and a little bit rainy. But we live in a beautiful place. We live in the forest, and we've made it more beautiful during lockdown by a lot, with getting rid of a lot of the invasive plants and planting a lot of things. And, I said to you, standing out there, just, even just for 5 minutes, I said, if I had to choose between never being able to be outside again and never being able to be on a computer again, the choice is so obvious, even though it would interfere with my ability to do what I want to do in the world and be creative and productive in the way that I need to. So being outside in nature is a big answer to what we both do when we're weary. And there are many other answers.
Yeah. I'm not sure how much I relate to the concept of being weary. There's certain things that just, I know they exist. It's not like I haven't felt them, but they just don't crop up that much. And, there's a lot of times when I'm just not productive the way I should be. I know what I should be producing and I'm not producing it. But that said, I do feel like we've chosen to live in a way that there's a lot that's thought-provoking, and sometimes being lost in thought and then finding something interesting and sparking a discussion and seeing where it goes, that process is productive over the long haul, even if you couldn't measure the productivity in a given day or a given week. So anyway, I've learned to trust that. And it's amazing how often the answer you've been looking for comes out of the blue after months, sometimes years of searching in what feels like an unproductive way. And I know those two things are not disconnected. So the searching doesn't feel productive, but it is productive. Therefore, you should hack the system so that you can feel productive with it without requiring yourself to deliver evidence, because eventually the thing, just emerges and it's like, oh, well, that was worth it.
Good. Does being left-handed say anything about humans, either psychologically, maybe physiologically? Psychologically isn't a thing we are. So I'm going to go with, I'm going to start over again and insert my interpretation of what this word is. Does being left-handed say anything about humans, either physiologically or psychologically? I love you guys. Thanks. So another topic about which I could talk endlessly. We as vertebrates have lateralization, which means we're bilaterally symmetrical, and we aren't perfectly symmetrical at the brain level, and therefore at the appendicular skeleton level. So all of us humans have not just a dominant hand, but also a dominant foot, a dominant ear, a dominant eye. And once you establish what your dominant hand is, it's likely that you have the same dominant foot and ear and eye, but not totally clear. And so what would be the value in having one be dominant over the other? Well, it's a kind of specialization, right? But then why shouldn't everyone in the population just have exactly the same specialization? It would certainly make it easier for the left-handers, myself included, if I didn't always have to find a different spatula, a different pair of scissors, and find when we're sharing cheese together, I have to switch it around to be able to access the correct end of the cheese, etc. But at a population level, having roughly 10% across all populations where it's ever been looked at, which is to say pretty much all human populations have been looked at, roughly 10% of the population being left-handed as opposed to right-handed, allows for a different kind of approach to situations, and not just a physical approach like, oh, I'm trying to climb a tree and all the right-handers before me couldn't get there, but the left-hander has a different vantage on it, but also just a different mental approach, from mental rotation to just mental gymnastics, metaphorical gymnastics, is differently allowed by a left-handed brain. It's also true that left-handers are less specialized with regard to lateralization, that we tend to have larger, more connected corpus callosums, which means that our left and right hemispheres are more connected. Of course, the trade-off being that it's harder to get things past one hemisphere with the other, and perhaps harder to find total, utter focus and go super deep. That, it's maybe more of a generalist paradigm. So there's a lot more to be said there. But
tantalizing fact, you tell me if I have it wrong. Enlarged corpus callosum accompanies the condition of being female, being gay and male, and being left-handed. Am I correct?
Yes, with the caveat that, so this is something I used to always say in my classes, and occasionally I'd get, so it's not just gay and male, it's just homosexual. So females, homosexuals, and left-handers all are understood, as I used to say to my classes a lot, to have larger corpus callosums than men, straight people, or right-handers. And, in almost every class I'd get someone going, I'm all three. But it's not better, it's different. It's just a different way of being that is better in some situations, but not others. And when I looked into it recently, I think that I remember that the data around women was actually a little bit more nuanced than it seemed, because, of course, like all of these things in a complex body like a human body, corpus callosum doesn't have strict boundaries. And so exactly what you're measuring is not totally clear. And if you measure it one way, it seems like females have slightly larger corpus callosums than men. But if you measure it maybe a slightly more standard way, that difference disappears. So I'm not sure that it totally holds up, but it seems to maybe.
So the data around women is harder to understand and smells better. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I said.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Is virus RNA more information intensive than human DNA? Referring to non-coding DNA. If that is the case, does it affect how viruses evolve compared to, say, mammals? Information intensive. I'm not sure what information intensive means.
I think what it means is less room for noisy stuff. And that's probably true. The fact of...
Just because it's more constrained by size?
Yeah.
Is that why you say it's probably true?
Yeah. That the cost of wasted space is higher relative to the total. That said, junk DNA is a concept that I'm proud to say never made a whit of sense to me.
And this person doesn't say junk; they say non-coding.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is non-coding stuff that is still contains information. Telomere would be a great example. So it's a little hard to evaluate your question, because there may be more of that stuff in, let's say, vertebrate DNA than there is in viral DNA, because maybe more of the viral DNA is protein coding or thereabouts. So anyway, it's hard to compare the two. I would say probably there's more room in vertebrates for noisy stuff and inefficiency, and so you might expect more of it. And yes, this would have an effect on evolution, because what it means is non-synonymous mutations would be more likely to be disruptive. So anyway, you might expect something like that to alter the rate of evolution under certain circumstances, or maybe all of them. So yes, broad brush, I think you're on the right track. How to say it specifically, I don't know. And I'm sure there are people who are expert in this exact question, and we're not them.
So we are at an hour and 10.
We are.
I think we're there.
All right.
Oh. Okay.
Well, we have arrived at the end of the Q&A. Wow, that flew by.
Yeah.
All right. So this has been excellent. We will return on Saturday, May 23rd, with a evergreen themed retrospective special live stream DarkHorse podcast and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So look forward to it.
At 12:30 Pacific.
12:30 Pacific. So like, subscribe, comment, hit notify, be well, stay safe, and we will see you on Saturday.